February 1st, 1942, 11:47 p.m. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. The fluorescent bulbs in Hut 8 cast sickly yellow light across rows of cluttered desks. Alan Turing stood motionless before a wooden table, his fingers pressed flat against intercept sheets covered in 5-letter groups. Beside him, cryptanalyst Hugh Alexander exhaled smoke from his third cigarette in 20 minutes, the ash trembling at the tip. Neither man spoke. The silence was suffocating. For months, Bletchley Park's brilliant minds had been reading German U-boat communications with methodical precision through the 3-rotor naval Enigma system, codenamed Dolphin. Convoy routes were adjusted, wolf packs were evaded, ships sailed safely across the North Atlantic, while Dönitz's submarines circled empty waters. But tonight, at the stroke of midnight, everything had changed. The Kriegsmarine had activated Triton, a 4-rotor Enigma variant designated M4. Allied codebreakers called it Shark, and with the addition of one extra rotor, just one thin cylinder of brass and wiring, the entire intelligence apparatus that had been guiding Allied convoys through the Atlantic was now blind. Turing ran his thumb across the edge of the intercept. The 5-letter group stared back at him, impenetrable. Where there had been clarity, there was now chaos. Where there had been strategic advantage, there was now a black void stretching across the entire U-boat communication network. "How long?" Alexander asked quietly. Turing didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the paper. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "Months, maybe longer. Wolfpack resurgent. March 1942, March 14th, 1942. 2:34 a.m., North Atlantic, 480 miles south of Iceland. Convoy SC-122 crawled through black waters at 7 knots. 41 merchant vessels moved in staggered columns, their hulls groaning under cargoes of steel, grain, fuel oil and ammunition bound for Britain. Above deck, lookouts scanned the horizon through frozen binoculars, their breath crystallizing in the sub-zero air. Captain Lieutenant Rolf Mützelberg peered through the periscope of U-203, his knuckles white against the steel handles. 3 miles to starboard, the silhouettes of freighters cut dark shapes against the moonlit horizon. Behind him in the cramped control room, torpedo officer Lieutenant Zursay Hans Fiedler stood ready at the firing panel, his hand hovering above the brass trigger. "Target bearing 290, Mützelberg whispered. "Range 3,000 meters. Angle on the bow, port 15. Fiedler's fingers moved across the mechanical calculator mounted to the bulkhead, cranking the solution into the torpedo guidance system. Around them, 23 other U-boats prowled the same coordinates. They had been guided here not by chance, but by German B-Dienst intelligence, signals, intercepts of Allied convoy routing codes that the British themselves had failed to protect adequately, while their attention remained locked on the now unreadable Shark cipher. The irony was brutal. Bletchley Park could no longer read German U-boat traffic, but German cryptanalysts could still partially read British convoy communications. The hunters had become invisible, while the prey broadcast their positions. "Fire 1, Mützelberg commanded. The U-boat shuddered as compressed air launched a G7E torpedo from Tube 1. 4 seconds later, Tube 2 released its weapon. The electric torpedoes streaked through the black water at 30 knots, their propellers leaving trails of bioluminescent plankton in their wake. 47 seconds later, the night exploded. The Shark, blackout, deepens. April-June, 1942. April 19th, 1942. 9:12 a.m. Admiralty Operational Intelligence Centre, London. Commander Roger Wynne stood before a wall-sized map of the North Atlantic, his left hand, permanently disabled from childhood polio, resting against the table edge. Red pins marked the last known positions of U-boat contacts. Blue ribbons traced convoy routes. Black crosses, too many black crosses, marked the locations of sunken merchant ships. 50 ships in January, 73 in February, 95 in March. And April was shaping up to be worse. Wynn's jaw tightened as he studied the board. For nearly 2 years, ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park had provided him with precise locations of U-boat patrol lines, allowing him to route convoys around the wolf packs. But since February 1st, that lifeline had been severed. He was now routing convoys based on guesswork, outdated patrol estimates, and hope. "Sir, another message from Bletchley," an aide said, approaching with a clipboard. Wynn took the paper without looking at the young officer. His eyes scanned the typed text. No breakthrough on Shark. Bomb machines ineffective against 4 rotor system. Estimated minimum 2 months to solution. Possibly longer. 2 months. They'd been saying 2 months since February. It was now mid-April. Wynn placed the paper face down on the table and returned his gaze to the map. Another convoy, HX-237, would depart Halifax in 3 days. 42 ships, 2,000 men, $50 million in cargo. He had to choose a route, north or south, fast or slow, through the Denmark Strait or along the Greenland coast. Every choice was a gamble now. Every route, a blind leap into waters that might, or might not, be swarming with submarines he could no longer see. By June, Allied shipping losses would peak at 124 vessels sunk in a single month, the highest monthly total of the entire war. Over 700,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. Oil tankers erupted into pillars of flame. Grain carriers split in half and vanished in under 2 minutes. Liberty ships broke apart, their welded seams tearing like paper. This was the second happy time for the U-boat crews. A period of slaughter not seen since the dark days of 1940, and it was all because of one extra rotor, desperation and mathematics. July-September 1942, July 23rd, 1942. 3:47 p.m. Hut 8, Bletchley Park. The bomb machine in the corner of the room clattered like a mechanical beast digesting steel. 36 rotating drums, each simulating an Enigma rotor, spun in coordinated patterns, testing thousands of possible settings per minute. But it wasn't enough. The 3-rotor bomb had been designed to break the 3-rotor Enigma. Against the 4-rotor M4 machine, it was useless. The mathematical complexity wasn't additive, it was exponential. Where a 3-rotor Enigma had 159 quintillion possible settings, the 4-rotor M4 had over 200 sextillion. You couldn't brute force 200 sextillion combinations, not with 1940s technology. Cryptanalyst Joan Clark sat hunched over a worksheet covered in letter frequencies and probable word patterns. Her pen moved in rapid strokes, circling clusters of 5-letter groups that appeared with statistical regularity across multiple intercepts. If she could find a crib, a known plain text phrase that appeared in the encrypted message, she might be able to deduce rotor settings. But the Germans had learned from earlier breaks. They'd eliminated predictable message formats. No more weather reports beginning with wetter, no more repeated call signs. The Kriegsmarine had tightened operational security across the board. Clark set her pen down and rubbed her temples. They needed a break. Not a mathematical breakthrough, though that would help, but a physical break. Captured material, codebooks, rotor wiring diagrams, current settings. They needed someone to board a U-boat before it sank and pull out the secrets buried inside. Hunter and Hunted, October 30th, 1942, October 30th, 1942. 5:11 a.m., 70 miles north of the Nile Delta, Mediterranean Sea. The short Sunderland flying boat banked through the dawn sky at 2,000 feet, its 4 Bristol Pegasus engines thrumming in synchronized rhythm. Flight Sergeant Peter Bramley squinted through the perspex canopy, scanning the grey surface of the Mediterranean for the telltale feather of a periscope wake. "There!" shouted the co-pilot, pointing to starboard. A thin white line cut through the water 800 yards ahead, U-559 running at periscope depth. Bramley banked hard right and pushed the control yoke forward, dropping the Sunderland into a shallow dive. In the rear gun blisters, waist gunners swiveled their 303 Brownings toward the target. The submarine's conning tower broke the surface as Captain Lieutenant Hans Heitmann realized his boat had been spotted and ordered emergency dive procedures too late. The Sunderland roared overhead at 120 knots, releasing 4 depth charges in a tight pattern. The Mark 8 charges plunged beneath the surface and detonated at 100 feet, sending columns of white water erupting skyward. U-559 shuddered violently, but continued its dive. Bramley circled back, transmitting coordinates on the emergency frequency. Within 30 minutes, 4 Royal Navy destroyers were steaming toward the intercept zone at flank speed. HMS Petard, HMS Hero, HMS Dulverton, and HMS Herworth. For the next 12 hours, the destroyers played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the wounded submarine. Depth charges rained down in methodical patterns, each detonation sending shockwaves through U-559's pressure hull. Rivets popped, seams leaked, light bulbs shattered. By 10:30 p.m., Heitmann had no choice. The boat was dying. "Surface, abandon ship," he ordered. U-559 broke through the surface 300 yards from HMS Petard. Immediately, Petard's forward guns opened fire. 4 7-inch shells screaming across the water and slamming into the submarine's conning tower. German sailors poured out of the hatches, diving into the oil-slicked sea as their boat listed heavily to port. Lieutenant Commander Mark Thornton, captain of HMS Petard, watched through binoculars as the U-boat's crew abandoned ship. The submarine was sinking, but slowly. Maybe 5 minutes before it went under, maybe 10. "Away, whaler! Boarding party, go!" Thornton ordered. Into the abyss, the boarding of U-559, October 30th, 1942, 10:37 p.m. North Atlantic. Lieutenant Anthony Fasson didn't wait for the whaler to reach the submarine. He dove from the launch and swam through frigid water toward the listing U-559, his arms cutting through the black surface in powerful strokes. Behind him, able seaman Colin Grazier followed, his breath coming in sharp gasps as the cold bit into his chest. They reached the hull and clambered up the slick metal, hauling themselves onto the angled deck. Water was already pouring over the stern. Fasson grabbed the ladder rungs inside the conning tower and descended into darkness. The interior of U-559 was a coffin of steel and seawater. Emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting red shadows across the control room. Fasson dropped into the compartment, seawater already ankle-deep and rising. Grazier landed beside him a moment later. "Captain's cabin aft," Fasson shouted over the rush of incoming water. They pushed through the narrow passageway, their boots sloshing through the rising flood. Fasson reached the captain's quarters and yanked open a steel locker bolted to the bulkhead. Inside, documents, codebooks, cipher materials. He grabbed an armful and turned back toward the conning tower. Above, 16-year-old NAFI canteen assistant Tommy Brown had climbed down into the boat against orders, his young face pale with fear, but his hands steady. "Here!" Fasson thrust a bundle of papers toward Brown. Brown grabbed them and scrambled back up the ladder, emerging into the night air and passing the materials across to sailors in the whaler. He descended again. Fasson and Grazier handed him a second bundle. More code sheets, the precious Kurzsignal, a short signal book, and the Wetterkurzschlüssel weather cipher. Brown climbed out a second time, then a third. On the third descent, Fasson was wrestling with the Enigma machine itself, trying to unbolt it from its mounting bracket. Grazier worked beside him, water now waist-deep and climbing faster. "We need to go!" Brown shouted from the ladder. "Bark's coming up!" Fasson yelled back, his voice strained. "Be careful, it looks important." But the water was rising too fast now. The stern of U-559 tilted further, the angle steepening as the submarine began its final plunge. "Out! Get out!" someone screamed from above. Brown scrambled up the ladder and dove clear of the conning tower. He surfaced 10 yards away, gasping, and turned back toward the submarine. Fasson and Grazier were still inside. U-559 tilted vertical, the bow pointing toward the stars for one suspended moment. Then, with a roar of collapsing air pockets and rushing water, it plunged into the depths. Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier went down with it. The key in the cipher, November-December 1942, November 3rd, 1942, 8:14 a.m., Hut 8, Bletchley Park. The water-stained documents from U-559 lay spread across Alan Turing's desk like holy relics. Some pages were barely legible, the ink smeared and running from seawater exposure. Others remained crisp and clear, protected by the oilskin pouch in which they'd been stored. Turing's fingers traced the columns of the Wetterkurzschlüssel, the short weather cipher. This was the breakthrough they'd been hunting for 10 months. The weather cipher was a simplified encoding system used by U-boats to transmit meteorological data quickly. It was still encrypted with the 4-rotor Enigma, but it used a limited vocabulary and predictable formats. Predictable formats meant cribs. Cribs meant they could reverse engineer rotor positions. Turing looked up at the team assembled around him, Hugh Alexander, Joan Clark, Gordon Welchman, and a dozen other cryptanalysts who'd spent the last 10 months staring at impenetrable 5-letter groups. His voice, when he spoke, carried no triumph, only exhaustion and grim determination. "We have a way in." For the next 5 weeks, Hut 8 operated at a feverish pace. The Wetterkurzschlüssel provided the crib patterns they needed to attack Shark. Bomb machines ran day and night, testing rotor configurations against the weather cipher intercepts. Slowly, agonizingly, the 4-rotor M4 system began to crack. December 13th, 1942, 6:23 a.m. After 10 months and 12 days of total blackout, Bletchley Park broke Shark. The first decrypted U-boat message came through at 6:47 a.m. It was a position report from U-456, transmitting coordinates in grid square BE52, southeast of Greenland. Within minutes, the Operational Intelligence Center in London had the information. Convoy ONS 154, currently steaming through adjacent waters, was immediately rerouted 40 miles south. They were no longer blind. The turning point, 1943 and beyond, January 8th, 1943, 2:11 p.m., Admiralty Operational Intelligence Centre, London. Commander Roger Wynne stood before the same wall map he'd stared at for 10 months of darkness. But now, the red pins marking U-boat positions were accurate again. Ultra-intelligence was flowing from Bletchley Park in a steady stream. Convoy routes could be adjusted in real time to evade wolfpack concentrations. The results were immediate and dramatic. In January 1943, Allied shipping losses dropped to 203,128 tons, less than a third of the previous month's carnage. In February, losses fell further. By June 1943, only 4 merchant ships per month were being sunk in the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, U-boat losses skyrocketed. In May 1943 alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 submarines, more than in the previous 6 months combined. Admiral Dönitz, faced with catastrophic attrition rates, withdrew most of his U-boats from the mid-Atlantic convoy routes that same month. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Between February and December 1942, the 10 months of the Shark blackout, Allied and neutral shipping losses in the Atlantic exceeded 6 million tons. Over 100 merchant vessels had been sunk. More than 50,000 merchant sailors had died. The 4-rotor Enigma M4 had achieved what no other weapon system could. It had brought Britain to the edge of starvation and defeat. One extra rotor, one additional layer of encryption complexity, had multiplied Allied shipping losses by a factor of 4 compared to periods when ultra-intelligence was operational. And it had taken the sacrifice of 2 men, Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, diving into a sinking submarine to retrieve waterlogged codebooks to break the German advantage. Section 9. The mathematics of secrecy. The Enigma M4 was not a revolutionary leap in technology, it was an incremental modification. The The Kriegsmarine had taken the existing three-rotor naval Enigma and added a fourth rotor, along with a thinner reflector to fit inside the same physical casing. From an engineering perspective, it was elegant. From a cryptographic perspective, it was devastating. The standard three-rotor Enigma machine offered 159 quintillion possible settings. 159,000. This was already an astronomically large number, but Bletchley Park had developed mechanical and mathematical methods to reduce the search space. The bomb machines, designed by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, exploited logical contradictions in the cipher to eliminate impossible rotor configurations. A three-rotor message could be broken in hours. But the four-rotor M4 expanded the key space to over 200 sextillion settings. 200,000. The existing bomb machines, optimized for three rotors, couldn't handle the increased complexity. They would need to be redesigned from scratch, a process that would take months, possibly years. Worse, the Germans had also improved their operational security. Message preambles were randomized, repeated phrases were eliminated. The predictable patterns that Bletchley Park had relied on to generate cribs, known plaintext fragments used to attack the cipher, had been systematically removed. Without cribs, without modified bombs, without captured materials, Shark was unbreakable. And for 10 months, that's exactly what it was. The Human Cost of Silence, February 14th, 1943, 3:42 p.m. SS Richard Bland, North Atlantic. Third Officer James Cathcart stood on the bridge wing of the Liberty ship SS Richard Bland, watching the grey horizon roll beneath low clouds. The convoy, HX-225, had been at sea for 8 days since departing New York, and so far they'd seen nothing but empty ocean. That was the point. Ultra-intelligence had routed them through a corridor between two U-boat patrol lines, threading the needle between wolf packs that didn't know the convoy was passing within 50 miles of their positions. A year ago, this convoy would have sailed blind, with a 20% chance of being intercepted and mauled. Now, thanks to the restored code-breaking capability at Bletchley Park, they moved through the Atlantic like ghosts. Cathcart didn't know about Ultra. He didn't know about Bletchley Park, or the Enigma machine, or the four-rotor M4 variant that had blinded Allied intelligence for 10 months. That information was classified at the highest levels, restricted to a handful of officers at the Admiralty, but he knew the statistics. Everyone in the Merchant Navy knew the statistics. In 1942, 1 in 4 merchant sailors who went to sea didn't come home, torpedoed in the middle of the night, burned alive in flaming oil, drowned in frigid water, crushed when their ship broke in half. The casualty rate among merchant mariners during the Battle of the Atlantic was higher than in any other branch of the Allied military. Over 30,000 British merchant sailors died during the war. Thousands more from Allied and neutral nations. They weren't soldiers, they were civilians, men who'd signed up to haul cargo across the ocean and found themselves on the front lines of a war fought in darkness and silence. And for 10 months in 1942, they'd been slaughtered. Not because of superior German tactics, or better torpedoes, or more aggressive U-boat commanders. They'd been slaughtered because of mathematics, because one extra rotor had expanded the Enigma key space beyond the reach of Allied codebreakers. Cathcart lit a cigarette and watched the convoy maintain formation. 5 columns of merchant ships, 8 vessels per column, flanked by 4 corvettes and 2 destroyers. 40 ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition and aircraft to a Britain that was still holding on, still fighting. They would make it to Liverpool. Ultra would see to that, but Cathcart would never know how close they'd come to losing. The American Solution. High-speed bombs, April 15, 1943. National Cash Register Company, Dayton, Ohio. Joseph Desch stood in the center of a cavernous factory floor, surrounded by rows of humming electromechanical calculators that looked like industrial refrigerators. Each machine was 7 feet tall, 5 feet wide, and weighed over 2 tons. They were 4 Rotor bomb machines, designed specifically to attack the Enigma M4 Cypher. And they were fast, much faster than the British bombs. Daesh had designed them from the ground up using high-speed relays and vacuum tube logic circuits. Where the British bombs tested rotor configurations at a rate of 20 per second, Daesh's machines could test 50. That 3-fold increase in speed translated directly into faster decryption times. By September 1943, over 120 American bombs were operational, splitting the workload with Bletchley Park and dramatically reducing the time needed to break daily shark settings. What had taken days in early 1943 now took hours. By late 1943, shark messages were being decrypted in under 24 hours on a routine basis. The code-breaking war had become industrialized. Daesh walked between the rows of machines, listening to the rhythmic clatter of rotating drums and clicking relays. Each machine represented thousands of hours of engineering work, millions of dollars in research funding, and the coordinated effort of hundreds of technicians and mathematicians. But it was working. U-boat losses continued to climb throughout 1943. In May, 41 submarines were sunk. In July, 37 more. By the end of the year, the Kriegsmarine had lost over 200 U-boats, more than half of Dönitz's operational fleet. The hunters had become the hunted, and it had all started with 2 men diving into a sinking submarine to retrieve a waterlogged codebook. Legacy of the Shark Blackout, May 8, 1945. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. The war in Europe was over. Alan Turing sat alone in Hut 8, the room silent except for the faint hum of ventilation fans. The bomb machines had been shut down. The intercept stations had stopped receiving German naval traffic. The cipher war was finished. But Turing couldn't stop thinking about the 10 months. February to December 1942, the Shark Blackout. The period when a single mechanical modification, 1 extra rotor, had blinded the most sophisticated code-breaking operation in history. Over 1,100 ships sunk. More than 50,000 men dead. Britain pushed to the brink of collapse, all because of 1 rotor. Turing understood the mathematics of secrecy better than almost anyone alive. He knew that cryptography was an arms race, a perpetual struggle between code makers and code breakers, where each side adapted and evolved in response to the other. The Enigma M4 had been Germany's response to the Allies' successful breaking of the 3-rotor system, and for 10 months it had worked perfectly. But it hadn't been enough. The capture of the weather cipher from U-559 had provided the crib patterns needed to attack Shark. The development of high-speed American bombs had industrialized the decryption process, and the relentless mathematical assault by Bletchley Park's cryptanalysts had ultimately broken the cipher. In the end, the 4-rotor Enigma had bought Germany 10 months of tactical advantage, 10 months of slaughter in the Atlantic, 10 months when convoys sailed blind and U-boats operated with near impunity, but only 10 months. After that, the advantage had swung back to the Allies, permanently. By 1943, the combination of restored ultra-intelligence, improved radar, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, and aggressive anti-submarine tactics had turned the Battle of the Atlantic into a killing ground for U-boats. Of the 40,000 men who served in Germany's U-boat force during World War II, 30,000 died. 3/4 of the entire submarine service, the highest casualty rate of any military branch in any nation during the war. And much of that slaughter had been enabled by the very intelligent system that the Enigma M4 had briefly blinded. Turing stood and walked to the window. Outside, spring sunlight filtered through the trees of Bletchley Park's grounds. Somewhere in the distance he could hear voices, people laughing, celebrating the end of the war. He thought about Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, diving into the flooded compartments of U-559 while the submarine sank beneath them. He thought about the 16-year-old canteen assistant Tommy Brown, making 3 trips up and down the conning tower ladder to retrieve documents before escaping seconds before the boat went under. Their sacrifice had broken the blackout. Their courage had restored Ultra. Their actions had saved thousands of lives and changed the course of the war. But history would never know their names. The work of Bletchley Park remained classified, a secret that would be kept for decades. The families of Fasson and Grazier were told only that their loved ones had died in action, with no details provided. Tommy Brown received no recognition for his heroism. The men who'd broken the most important cipher of World War II would remain unknown. And Alan Turing, sitting in the silent room where he'd spent 4 years fighting a war of mathematics and logic, understood that this was the nature of secret victories. The public would never know how close they'd come to losing. They would never understand that the fate of nations had turned on one extra rotor, one captured codebook, and 2 men who'd chosen to dive into a sinking submarine rather than swim to safety. But Turing knew, and that would have to be enough.